if you're in an intensive care unit and you're on a ventilator and you're sick and you're having fevers, even though there's no identified source of infection, we've learned that most of those patients are on antibiotics. So what are the consequences of that? We call this cause ecological collapse of the normal microbiome. And, you then replace that normal health promoting microbiome with what we've termed a pathobiome, meaning pathogenic bacteria that generally cause harm, become predominant in your gut. And that disbalance, dysbiosis, whatever you want to call it, can directly impair the immune system and directly and adversely affect the outcome.
Hey folks, it's Mike Mutzel here with HighIntensityHealth.com. Thanks so much for tuning back in to episode number 111. And today we're live with Dr. John Alverdy, and he is at University of Chicago School of Medicine at the surgical department. And I came across some of his research. So we're going to pick his brain on the gut bacteria and some of his later work. So John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Fantastic. So let's dive into some of the work that you've been conducting and publishing and so forth in your group. I believe it's kind of focused on the gut microbiome, but if maybe you could kind of introduce yourself to our listeners and what your role is at University of Chicago.
Sure. So I am a gastrointestinal surgeon. I operate on patients who have problems with their stomach or their esophagus, their pancreas, their gallbladder, that kind of thing. And I take care of a wide variety of patients, patients who have serious infections from pancreatitis or their gallbladder, and to patients who suffer from obesity. We do these stomach bypasses and restriction type things, operations. I have a NIH-funded laboratory that studies how gut bacteria complicate the recovery from surgery. And that's really fortunate because I'm at a research university and a research hospital. I take care of patients with serious infectious problems, and I am an operating surgeon. And all patients' worst fear is that they'll develop an infection after a big operation. This is especially problematic when prosthetic material is put in, like a hip or rods in your back, or part of your blood vessels are being, reconstructed. And so I've been doing this for 20 years, and I have a lot of expertise in applying the latest molecular techniques to try to understand problems that sort of have eluded surgeons that they've always framed as mechanical problems. Why did this happen? Well, you didn't put the stitch in right, or you didn't wash your hands, or this, that, and the other. And there are many more complicated explanations for that. I'm also the president of the Surgical Infection Society of North America, which is a group of academic surgeons who meet yearly and discuss infections in surgery.
Wow, fantastic. You have quite an impressive background. And what I like most about your work is you're really trying to bring this bench to bedside understanding and get people kind of to increase their awareness of the gut microbiome and different changes associated with surgery. And one of your recent papers was about prolonged intensive care unit stay. It's actually linked with reduced bacterial diversity and increased susceptibility to sepsis. So maybe we could start off with, how did this hypothesis come about, maybe some early observations, and then what were the results of that study?
Right. So one of our biggest challenges, of course, is that most surgery is surgery that's done and you're in the hospital and you recover and you go home the next day, have your hip replaced or your knee operated on, or your gallbladder removed, and you're not sick, you're not critically ill. You come in, you go home, you start eating your regular food in a few days, and basically you're able to heal because your return to normalcy, eating a regular diet, the stress, you get one shot of antibiotics. It may stun your microbiome, but you're back in your own home and you can re-faunate back to normal pretty quickly. And that's, there are 80,000 elective operations done every day. Most of them are like that. However, patients who get really sick, let's say they are in a terrible car accident, or they have a burn injury, or they undergo a liver transplant where they're really sick for a long time and their recovery is prolonged. As far as your microbiome is concerned, time is not your friend, right? And when I say that is for every day you're sick like that, it's very difficult for clinicians, doctors who are taking care of patients, to not give you antibiotics. So if you're in an intensive care unit and you're on a ventilator and you're sick and you're having fevers, even though there's no identified source of infection, we've learned that most of those patients are on antibiotics. So some doctors will talk about sepsis syndrome, sepsis meaning when you get really sick, you're inflamed, you're on dialysis, your heart rate's high. And if you haven't identified a source of infection, they call that non-infected sepsis. But if you have an identified source, they call it infected sepsis. And really, what's interesting is you say, well, then all the non-infected sepsis patients, none of them are on antibiotics, right? No, 80% of them are taking antibiotics. But I thought you said they don't have an infection. Well, we think we don't have any evidence that they have an infection, but there may be some germ lurking, in their sinus or in their gut or in some little crypt or in some pocket, and I don't want to not give them antibiotics. So what are the consequences of that? We call this cause ecological collapse of the normal microbiome, and you then replace that normal health-promoting microbiome with what we've termed a pathobiome, meaning pathogenic bacteria that generally cause harm, become predominant in your gut. And that disbalance, dysbiosis, whatever you want to call it, can directly impair the immune system and directly and adversely affect the outcome. Because the outcome is not you're going to be better in a day or two. You might take 2 weeks to recover. Now, what is happening to your immune system as your microbiome erodes? That's what we're most interested in, because there's evidence now that the actual bacteria that you normally have in your gut, they're driving a normal systemic immune response. So this is an exaggeration, but if I cut your scalp, which is very far away from your gut,
yeah.
If you have a good, robust gut microbiome, it's pushing, it's driving, it's stimulating all the immune cells in your body to heal that scalp wound. And while that seems a loose metaphor, there's some very strong evidence for that now. There's actually several papers showing that if you make a sterile incision in an animal away from the gut, it heals much worse if you destroy the gut microbiome.
Which is exactly what we're doing, if I heard you correctly, with all the prophylactic antibiotic use. Is that what we're saying?
Well, I'm glad they're antibiotics. I think most lives have been saved by antibiotics, but clearly we're overusing them. We almost, their overuse becomes unavoidable in certain situations. And now it's time, because we have the molecular tools to understand it, now is the time to really instantiate some great science into these patients' clinical course to really try to inform ourselves about, is there a better way to do this? Is there a way to stop these antibiotics or narrow their spectrum or use alternative approaches when we can do them? One study was just recently done was published in the New England Journal by a member of the Surgical Infection Society, Robert Sawyer, who is a former president, like I am. He did a study where he said, I'm going to take this group of surgical patients that are being treated for a serious infection, and even though they recommend giving 10 days of antibiotics, I'm going to randomize one group to say, okay, those are the recommendations, 10 days. We don't know why the 10 days. What about 7 days? The drug company's not going to sponsor that trial.
Right.
That's great. You want to cut my business in half by doing a study? I don't think so. So he got the National Institutes of Health to do it. And he did 5 days instead of, I think, 7 to 10 days. And the results were the same. So why are we doing 7 to 10 days? Well, because we always did 7 to 10 days.
Yeah, just the habit, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. Dr. John, can you tilt your camera down just a touch? It's kind of look at the ceiling, and I think that'd be, yeah.
Is that
There we go. That's a little bit better. Yeah, you just have a great shirt on and tie it up. I'd love for people to see that.
all right?
Great information there, Dr. John. Now let's talk about the nutrition in the hospital setting. What role do you think that has on the composition and or reduced bacterial diversity with associated with long stays in the hospital? Do you think there's a factor there? What sort of foods should people be eating if they can eat foods? Maybe they don't have gastrointestinal surgery. It's another kind of systemic procedure. Any thoughts there?
Yes. So I worked in that field a long time, and it's very interesting that our GI tract is a bioreactor. So all the bacteria in our GI tract are the ones that through which the food first passes, and it has an effect on our health. So I'm gonna use maybe an unscientific but interesting analogy about this. So it would be wonderful if we could figure out what is in delicious wine and run it through a mass spectrometer and understand each and every chemical that's in there, and then just synthesize perfect wine without having to grow the grapes and everything. And that's never going to happen because, the whole is much more than the sum of the parts. And there's a certain chemistry and fermentation that has to go on. These in physics are called emergent properties that emerge that you cannot predict are going to emerge when you mix two things together. And so we have that same problem in the gut. The foods that we give in the hospital because patients are sick are those foods that we've deduced those are what's in the blood. What goes in your mouth ends up in your blood. So let's just make chemicals that should be in your blood, and we'll pass them through your gut or directly into your vein, and that should be good enough for you. And it turns out that's not it.
Yeah.
So then, to the same analogy with wine, people say, let's see what's growing in the gut, what the bacteria are making, short-chain fatty acids, glutamine, let's take all those chemicals that the bacteria are making from the foods that we eat, mix those up in a formula, and that should do it. And that's definitely not working. And so, we do what we can. These are called chemically defined diets. We know they're inadequate. We know they don't have the same effect on the microbiome, which then affects the immune system as eating regular food. But patients cannot eat regular food when they're very sick. Mm-hmm. So it's a big trade-off there. Again, the science that's so exciting with the microbiome, metabolomics, proteomics, microbial genetics, we're hoping that we can make some really path-breaking discoveries that will allow us to, have the right food in there. Just probably like there's no substitute for mother's milk.
Right.
Right. Everyone, Nestle and all these companies, Abbott would love to have a infant formula that's as good as breast milk. It hasn't come yet.
Yeah, probably will be a long time before that's
correct.
Commercially available. Yeah, well said there, Dr. John. Now, a clinical study came out at the end of 2013, I believe, or 2012. It was in cancer patients that were recovering from, it was colon cancer, and they took an enteric-coated probiotic, and they saw some beneficial effects in cytokine signaling, recovery, and so forth compared to control. So any tips or preliminary data that we should know about for people that may be getting elective surgery? Maybe they would take a probiotic or prebiotic ahead of time. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, so we're those of us that work in this field are very reluctant to offer any advice, clinical advice, based on the information that we have now. There are a number of studies that have shown that probiotics, and again, just to define them, they're live cultures of bacteria that are thought to be health-promoting bacteria. And you can take them in large amounts and hopefully overpopulate your gut with more good guys than bad guys. What we don't know is what happens to them when you get a big slug of antibiotics, because you take them, let's say for a week before the surgery, then you go into surgery and the doctor gives you, especially for colon surgery, they give you oral pills to clean out your gut and very strong intravenous antibiotics. And you hope, that destroys the Amazon rainforest in your gut, but you're hoping that the probiotics you took kind of hang in there and tie you over. And that may be what they're seeing. I think, this is a personal opinion, and I know this is the opinion of many very large companies. If you could really boil that science down to much more high resolution readouts, much more granular information about what you need, you could really come up with something that's very powerful. And I think they're on the right track. It's just that, many of those over-the-counter drugs are one strain or two strains of bacteria. And, just as a garden doesn't look beautiful with one seed of flower, you're not going to, in my opinion, be able to faunate and maintain the diversity that you need to maintain your health with a single strain of bacteria. Also, we need to probably rethink about how to give those regimens of antibiotics, because again, they're unavoidable. We shouldn't have to wipe out our whole gut microbiome just to prevent getting a wound infection. Right. Maybe there's a way of locally delivering the antibiotics without having to give them systemically, so that you can keep what you have. Your friends with benefits, you can keep them, and you can wipe out any invaders that might be coming in the wound when a surgeon makes an incision.
Yeah, beautifully said, and great practical advice there. Now, there's an emerging kind of notion in research, this low-grade sepsis known as metabolic endotoxemia. And up to now, we've been talking about surgical-induced or trauma-induced sepsis, which would be kind of an overt perforation in the intestinal lining. Right. Can you speak to this metabolic endotoxemia? And you mentioned that you work with overweight patients, and we know that there's at least some correlations between high blood levels of endotoxin and links with diabetes and obesity. Any comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's very interesting, and it probably speaks to what is in the lay press has been referred to as the leaky gut syndrome, which is where the lining of your intestine has somehow lost its integrity, and bacteria seep out. Not bacteria, but the bacterial exoproducts, the secreted proteins and toxins of bacteria, and they somehow leach into your bloodstream in very low amounts. You don't get, frankly, septic, but that it triggers an immune response. And so, you're inflamed. You have a low-grade inflammation. And this spans all the way from diseases, disorders like autism, fibromyalgia. People are even invoking neurodegenerative disorders such as multiple sclerosis and a bunch of other diseases for which there's no identified infectious agent, like with polio or with tuberculosis. It's still a theory, and it's not clear that the endotoxin in the blood, whether that's just a marker for the problem or actually driving the problem. It's more likely to be a marker. Well, there's something wrong, and yes, your gut's leaky, but the actual cause of that problem is not just the endotoxin in the blood. That's the consequence of the problem. The driving cause is something else. And the more we grind down on the gut bacterial interface, think of this for a moment. Your gut's so smart that when you eat food, it only lets all the good stuff in and keeps all the bad stuff out. That's a pretty discriminating GI tract. At the same time, it can survey everything that's in there and make sure you're ready for anything at any time. And it does that in a very complicated way. It's not just these gates that open and close and let things through. It's much more molecularly complex. There are ways for bacteria to get into lymph nodes, and then those lymph nodes, it's sort of like having secondary and tertiary checkpoints. The lymph nodes might say, how did you escape through here? And that'll kill it and detoxify it. And much of the endotoxin that seeps out anyway is detoxified so rapidly that it's hard to imagine it's, a classic, I'm being intoxicated by my own bacteria.
Sure.
It's a little much of a naive explanation for probably a very complex problem.
Sure. Well said there, Dr.
Yeah.
John. Now, what about obesity and microbial shifts and maybe some of the shifts that you've seen pre and post surgery? I know there's some data showing that with Rowan-Y, I believe, is one of the procedures. Can you speak to the gut microbiome, obesity, and gastric bypass and bariatric surgery?
So probably a really good paper that came out in Science Translational Medicine just, I want to say maybe a year ago or less, by a physician scientist named Lee Kaplan at Massachusetts General Hospital. Lee is a hepatologist, a liver specialist, and a PhD scientist. He's an MD, PhD, and does outstanding work in this field. And he performed gastric bypasses on mice and then looked at their stool and saw that their stool microbiome dramatically changed. And they lost weight, of course, because they had a gastric bypass. And then he took that stool and he transplanted that stool before they lost weight and after they lost weight, before their microbiome was changed and afterwards, and was able to show that that change in the microbiome actually played a role in the weight loss, because it took mice that underwent no surgery that were overweight, and it actually made them lose weight and improve their glucose tolerance, their metabolic syndrome, some of their liver disorders where they get fatty liver. And so, it raises a lot of hope that, gee, the way whatever the gastric bypass does, either by imposing dramatic restriction to what you can eat, and that then independent of each other or both, that process can lead to changes in your microbiome that can change your energy efficiency, your energy regulation. And it'd be great to think, this is the big leap of faith, that you could just take that pill and lose weight. Mm-hmm. Because it is probably true that people who struggle with their weight their whole life are people who have some type of altered energy balance. Yes, they're overeating relative to what they burn off, but why time after time do they want more food than they actually need? And you could say, well, it's all volitional, it's all sociocultural. That's certainly one hypothesis. I don't think that's the case. Another hypothesis is that, yes, they're overeating relative to what they're burning off, but they have a drive to overeat that volition cannot manage. Mm-hmm. And that's why they're overweight. Well, what's driving it? Well, it's these nefarious, sinister gut bacteria that want to make their host chubby. And so can you, again, do you know what a bone marrow transplant is? I'll explain it very simply. If you have leukemia or lymphoma, all the cells in your bone marrow where you make white cells and red cells, they're coming out malignant and they're going into your bloodstream and they're giving you blood cancer. So you get a bone marrow transplant or a stem cell transplant where we radiate you and give you chemotherapy and nearly kill you by wiping out all the blood cells in your body. But then we give you a graft of stem cells or bone marrows from, a donor that then repopulate and graft you to have new cells. And so that's a scary process. Imagine if you could take an overweight patient and wipe out their microbiome and then reseed them with a thin microbiome. Now that would be incredible and great because we wouldn't have to do the surgery. We're a long way away from that, but that's very exciting if it's the case.
Yeah. So what I heard you say, maybe a hint at, is if we could induce some sort of effective fecal microbiota transplantation instead of, say, a bariatric surgery gastric bypass, that may be more effective down the road, but we don't know exactly, how that would work for every single person.
That's correct. And one of the things about your own microbiome that's good but also frustrating is that, you acquired it when you were very young, and it's not 100% stable over your life, but there are a lot of microbes in there that have home field advantage, and they're not leaving. Because just think about all the antibiotics people take, and they eat food and they drink badly and they don't get enough sleep, and their microbiomes pretty much stay and hang in there. Yeah. And so wiping it out is, it's going to be no easy feat. I'm sure somebody will figure out how to do it, but cleaning everything out and then having this new graft take over is not going to be just taking a few pills. It's probably going to be something pretty complicated, and it's probably going to have some side effects to it.
Right.
So it sounds great, or you get something and it's not durable. You have a few hiding in there. You get this new graft, like a liver transplant or something. It doesn't last forever.
Right.
Unless you completely engraft. Some liver transplants, you may know this, they chimerize with their host. They become one, and you don't need any more immunosuppression. It's like your body accepts it 100%, and you are literally engrafted for life with that liver. You don't need to take another pill again. And, of course, transplant biologists have been trying to figure out how to make that happen all the time.
Right.
But it doesn't. But this is the unknown of this science. So it's no different than any other transplant.
Sure. Great info there, Dr. John. If we could finish up a little bit on gut hormones, I know that's another aspect of the metabolic effects that are linked with bariatric surgery, gastric bypass, and possibly the interactions with the anti-inflammatory potential. Any words of wisdom or parting advice on what we should know about gut hormones?
Yeah. So, again, we live in a world of medical science that is very host-centric. What I mean is, I want to know what's causing my headache. You say this hormone, this mediator, this chemical, and and that's how most drugs have developed over the last 50 years. Billions of dollars go into research, and you want to get intellectual property around this pathway, this one chemical that binds to this one site, and you want to block that binding, and bingo, you've got your billion-dollar drug. And if you look at, it's sort of the pipeline for new drugs, we're spending more and more and getting less and less drugs because the problems that we're trying to address now, Alzheimer's, obesity, and those, they're complicated problems. So there are several hormones that are candidate hormones that make you feel hungry. One of them is ghrelin. And a lot of the operations that we do for obesity knock down that hunger hormone. But studies have shown that that may be, again, the consequence of the surgery, not the driving reason that you're not hungry. So there's probably multiple signals going up to your brain. What mama cooked, when you were young and you walked in and it smelled, how your microbiome has changed, how your tastes have changed, what age you are, that affect all these systems that converge onto other systems that then mediate the idea of feeling, and I always like to say this to my patients, feeling mechanically full, which is, I ate too much. Feeling pleasured, wow, that ice cream tasted good. And then feeling satisfied and full. And each of those things are different, aren't they? You can eat a bag of rice cakes and you're like, I'm full, but you're not really satisfied. Yeah. You can eat this much Ben & Jerry's and you can say, wow, I am really pleasured. But like a half hour later, you're hungry because you're not satisfied. You haven't shut down eating. So how all that plays in is a little funny. The field of new drugs for obesity has tried to exploit all those hormones that make us feel hungry or make us feel full. And the frustration is they work. They don't get you down where you want to go. If you're 300 pounds, they don't get you down to 150. And then the other problem is you tolerize to those drugs. You keep getting them, and all of a sudden they don't work anymore. And also, the minute you stop them, you're hungry. and you gain all your weight back. So if you took a 30-year-old who's 300 pounds and you said, okay, you take these 5 hormones, how long do I have to take them, doc? Forever. It's not it hasn't, well, I don't want to say it never is a good approach, but it hasn't really led to the wonder drug for obesity.
Mm-hmm. And which makes the whole food substances pretty exciting. I know some researchers at Duke University have shown different proteins like pea protein, whey protein, different fibers to beneficially affect these gut hormones. And if we could finish off with your favorite nutrient or herb or whole food substance that you feel that you recommend to your patients for improving either their gut microbiome and or the secretion of these gut hormones, what sort of words of advice do you have there?
Yeah, I try not to do that very much, because I think that, I would be speaking outside the confines of scientifically foundational information. But I think that, if you pinned me down, I think one of the most important things to do is to not overeat and not eat more than you need, and try to remain lean. And eat a balanced diet, and mostly, fruits and vegetables. Meats are very good, but in sparing amounts. Not in sparing, in small amounts, enough that you need, and avoid eating too much animal fat. And then you have to exercise, because you're actually your microbiome knows when you're exercising and when you're not, because of the release of the chemicals from your body. So to the extent that you keep your gut healthy, which is eating just as much as you need and exercising, I think that's the best advice I can give now based on the science that's out there.
Yeah, that's great advice, Dr. John. Now, one final question that we ask every guest on the show: if you were to bump shoulders with Barack Obama or a future president, maybe someone from the World Health Organization, and share with them one tip about the gut or the gut microbiome or just health in general, in 30 seconds, what would you want them to know?
Well, I would want them to know that we have embarked on a very important aspect of science that has the potential to prevent disease in a way that we have not imagined before. When the Human Genome Project came out, there were projections that if we just sequence and we know all of our human genes, we're going to prevent Alzheimer's disease and this, that, and the other. And now we're learning that we have so much of the environment that changes our own, not our structure of genes, but the way our genes interact with the environment, happens through the GI tract. So our scourges, diabetes, obesity, early aging, all of the expenditures of our healthcare maybe have to do with the way we've abused modern progress or human progress to indulge in foods that are harmful for us and chemicals that are harmful for us, and be dependent on drugs that we have to take for the rest of our lives. So I would urge them to funnel more money toward microbiome research and prevention. If we could understand how our bioreactors function, we could say, look, we need a better breast milk substitute. Look, we need to not have children take antibiotics because we have the science to prove it, unless they really, really need it and they're life-saving in the early ages. We need mothers who are bearing children to eat proper diets and not smoke and not drink alcohol, because it affects their microbiome, and their kid is sort of genetically doomed for the rest of their life. All these things, imagine the huge shift 100 years from now. The diseases that we have that we're trying to solve by finding this one hormone or this one chemical, we're spending billions of dollars, we just see melt away. These are all called Alzheimer's, autism, multiple sclerosis. These are called diseases of human progress. Well, what about human progress are we doing wrong?
Right.
And maybe the secret lies in understanding the gene-gene interactions between our environment, our gut microbiome, and our human genes.
Wow.
So more money for research. That's what I do.
I love that. Beautifully said there. I think our listeners are going to hit the rewind button and listen to that a couple of times there, Dr. John. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I'm a fan of your work and your research. So we'll make sure that we have all your references and current publications on our website at highintensityhealth.com/Dr. Alverdy. And anything that we should know about upcoming trials or publications that you're working on before we part ways?
One really exciting trial we're working on, we're going to be submitting a very large grant to the National Institutes of Health on, and we have 20 of the premier university medical centers participating, is a problem called anastomotic leak. And that's when a surgeon cuts out part of your intestine and then sews the two ends back together. In a small percentage of patients, 5 to 7%, that connection that the doctor or the surgeon beautifully sews together can leak, and you can get very sick and even die from that. And we've discovered that has to do with your microbiome and some bad bacteria that linger in that area. And we've proven that in animals, and now we're going to prove that and have a way of preventing it in humans. So nobody has to walk around with a colostomy or an ileostomy, and somebody who's facing cancer surgery on their colon, they want the cancer to be cut out and they want to be cured. They don't have to go into surgery thinking, I'm going to leak and I'm going to be septic and I might be in the hospital 2 months. And that's really exciting. If we could, it'll be a game changer if we can start this trial. And if the results turn out the way we think they are, we'll be very excited by that.
Yeah, that's very exciting. The quality of life would be dramatically improved for those individuals. So again, Dr. John Alverdy, really appreciate you coming on the show, and hope you have a fantastic day and keep up the great work.
All right. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.